Okay guys, so today I want to talk about post-processing, but in order to talk about post-processing, like the light bloom effects that you're seeing here, sort of the glowing halo and the lens dirt effects that you can see here, but in order to talk about that, I'm really also going to have to talk about volumes first of all. So I'm running this post-processing package from the asset store, mainly because it's free. And it supports Unity 2017. As you can see, we're still a little bit behind here. It's the one by these guys, Cybernetic Walrus. So if you're downloading it and you want to follow along, then you can do exactly what I do. But ultimately, what I'm going to be talking about today is more what post-processing is and why you need to think about volumes in order to use it. When we talk about volumes, the volumes that we're familiar with are the collider volumes, the volumes that you put around objects. If I just frame in on this one here, you can see it's got this collider around the outside. If I drag it, I can make the collider bigger and so on. And the things that we've mostly used volumes for up to this stage have been to run collision effects, like trigger effects. On trigger enter, destroy the game object. And you can see that if I go up to it and move over it, I have indeed collected it. And the reason that's been collected is because the player has crossed the threshold, the edge of this particular volume here, this trigger volume, which in this case is a sphere. But a volume can be any shape and any size, and really just refers to anything that the player can go into that will change the effect. So what I've done is I've downloaded this post-processing package here, and if you're watching this video to find out how to hook up the Cybernetic Walrus post-processing package, then this bit is it. So essentially you download the package like this. In the documentation here, it says to put the scripts, post-processing volume script here, to put this script on any game object. So what I did is I created a little cube like this. Doesn't matter what the size is because you're going to change the size of the volume using the script in a second. Just turn the mesh renderer and the collider off so I don't bump into it, and just name it effects so I can find it in my hierarchy when I click off and there's nothing to click on in my scene. So if I click on this cube here and I add the post-processing script, you'll see I get all these options coming up here. The first one is this box, which controls the shape. It can be a box or a sphere. The ones that are really interesting, the ones that are really useful, are going to be the outer box and the inner box. At the moment that's 1 and that's 0, and if I frame in on the object, you can't even see the inner box because it doesn't exist. So this big blue box controls where the effect will start to happen. As soon as you cross over the threshold into the blue box, whatever effect you've put on there, I'll go through some in a minute, will start to happen. I'm just going to enlarge this so it's 10 by 10 by 10 and pull back a little bit. This inner box here, and again I'm just going to enlarge it so it's 2 by 2 by 2, so you can see the yellow box here. This inner box controls where the effect is fully resolved. So the effect will start to take effect, whatever I've put on here, whatever the post-processing effect I've put on here, will start to take effect as soon as I cross the blue threshold, and it will finally take effect as soon as I cross the yellow threshold. Up until that point, it will interpolate. It will gradually fade into whatever the effect is. And some of the post-processing effects that come with this include bloom, darker, and depth of field, and I'll talk about each of these three separately in a second. But first of all, I want to use bloom. So in order for this cube to affect your whole scene, you'll need to make it the size of your whole scene, and then you'll need to decide where the epicenter of the effect is going to be. So what I've done actually here is I've already created a prefab for this, so I can delete my effect here, and I'm just going to drag my effect cube onto my scene here, and if I roll back you can see that it kind of covers most of the area that I'm going to be in when I start the game. In this instance, the camera with a little character controller on is my player. I'm going to drag the one that says post-processing volume receiver onto the camera. And when I drag it onto the camera like so, I get this here, post-volume receiver script, and I also get this behavior script down here. You need both of these in order to determine what's going to happen. So if I look at the options, I can see there's the basic, a bloom, a darker, and the depth of field. I'm going to put bloom on there for now. I'm just going to push play. So what's happening now is I'm getting a light bloom effect. Light bloom is where the light from an object, in this case an emissive material, an object with an emissive material on, diffuses out almost as though it's kind of glowing. And the closer I get to it, the more diffuse it becomes. You'll see I've got this lens dirt on the frame as well. I'll talk about how I put that on in a second. So at this point, it's worth talking about what post-processing is so that we can understand exactly what's happening on the screen. And a good way to understand this is to know what rendering is. So let's say you've created something in Maya, something like this robot. And let's say I've animated the robot and I want to create an animation. I'm not doing anything to do with games design. I'm going to do a 3D style Pixar animation. Maya will allow me to create that scene using a timeline. But if I ever want to get it out of Maya, a little bit like getting a video editing project out of something like Adobe Premiere, I will need to render. So when we render anything out, what we're essentially doing, what the word render means, is to cause to be or to become, to make. So we're going to use this 3D model here to make a video, to make an animation, to render it out. So when we do this, we have a few decisions to make. And that's where we go to the render settings. I'm not going to get into what these different settings do because that's not what this video is all about. But if you change the settings, effectively what you're doing is you're changing the quality and frame rate at which this video comes out. Now that's for pre-rendered animation. If we're in Unity, rendering takes place 30 frames per second. Rendering is the way that all of these game objects appear visible to the player as they move around the scene. So essentially, rendering is done through the camera, which is why we're dragging post-processing effects scripts, the post-processing volume receiver script here, onto the camera, because whatever happens inside this cube, the camera is the one that's going to render it. It's going to make it possible for the player to see what is going on. So what is going on? Well, if we take a look at the effect cube also has a script on it, the post-processing volume script. That's this one here in the scripts in post-processing volume of this folder here. In here, I get a whole range of options. So here I can look at things like motion blur, depth of field, bloom, color grading, and so on and so forth. I'm just going to take a look today at depth of field and bloom. So bloom is a post-processing effect that changes the way light is received by the camera and processed out. So here we've got a scene that's been lit. We've got these neon lights, these signs, this background, this sort of Blade Runner-esque futuristic scope, but it doesn't really pop. The light's quite flat, it's quite boring. Here, on the other hand, where the neon sign is supposed to glow, where the light is supposed to diffuse, where this orange glow, this sodium glow is supposed to kind of really light up the scene, this is what bloom does. I'll show you another example of bloom. So these are some light bloom effects that you might have seen in games, the idea that the light's kind of diffusing around the edge of the object, lights diffusing around the edge of the windows here, around the edge of the curtains. This is what a light bloom effect is. And obviously it's going to make your scene look a lot more realistic than if you didn't have it in. So remember that while the camera is doing all the heavy lifting and is actually processing the effect itself has gone on this cube, and everything inside that cube will be affected by whatever this particular effect is. And I've said here that this one I want to use bloom. So on the object itself, I've enabled bloom. I could enable other things as well. I won't just now. You can change the intensity and the threshold, the softness and the radius. I've found the settings that I'm happy with, and I've dragged a lens dirt texture in from some of the default textures that ship with this processing package. Back on my camera now, I need to make sure that this has got a behavior script on. And again, I've just chosen one of the basic presets, and because I want bloom, I've chosen bloom. And if I push play now, everything inside my cube is being affected by the light bloom. And as I get closer and closer and closer to the source, the more and more and more intense it becomes. And you can see those dirt specks on the camera there. So if I step right back through the edge of the box, you can see when I step outside what happens. There's no bloom, there's nothing, it's just the normal scene. So this particular post-processing package actually comes with an example scene here, which can be quite useful, if I just quickly push play, to see what the different sorts of effects are. So each of these rooms that you can see in front of you, and there are 3 of them, each of these rooms has a different effect in it. This room has the darker effect, the darker preset. So the more you go in the epicenter, it gets darker, and then it's lighter coming out of the other side. And you can see where you're crossing over the threshold of the blue towards the inner yellow cube. Now we're totally inside the yellow cube. We're feeling the full effect, and now we're crossing back out again. In this room here, it's depth of field. I'm going to demonstrate that in a second because it's not really clear on this screen here. And then finally in this last room here is the bloom I've just shown you, and you can see what happens as the bloom kind of comes on and then sort of fades out again at the other side. So if we quickly go back into my scene, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my effect cube so that it's not rendering bloom. I'm going to disable bloom, and I'm going to enable depth of field. So depth of field is a post-processing technique that's designed to mimic what real cameras with real lenses can do. And I'll show you an example of this here. This frame here, this still from a film, has what we call a very deep depth of field because everything's in focus. She's in focus, he's in focus, this window's in focus, this guy outside is just about in focus. This is a deep depth of field. Everything is in focus. Now here on the other hand, he's in focus, but the banister, the woman behind him, the rest of the scene is out of focus. This is a shallower depth of field, and here it's an incredibly shallow depth of field. She's in focus, but everything else is out of focus. That's what depth of field allows you to do. I'm just going to move the epicenter of my cube so that it sits on my zombie, not on my human. And I'm going to decrease the size of the box so it's 3 by 3 by 3. This is the inner yellow box, so I really have to be kind of pretty much on the zombie in order to see the effects of this here and here. So in this instance, with these settings here, if I start the game, then I get the normal sort of rendering, but as I get closer, he's blurry and blurry and blurrier. The thing behind remains in focus, and he's out of focus. But in order to really get the most out of this, you need to have an object that's quite close to you and an object that's quite far away. So what I'm quickly going to do is I'm going to make the cube a child of the zombie, and I'm going to bring the zombie towards me. And now if I push play, the zombie is out of focus, but the thing behind him is in focus. So if I want that the other way around, you can see, I'm just backing away a little bit. From out here, everything's sort of in focus, it's a bit small. I get a bit closer, he's in focus, but the background is kind of shifting out of focus slightly. I can see him fairly clearly, but not the background. It's because I've reduced the focal distance here and increased the focal length here. And you'll need to play around with these settings to find exactly what it is you want to do. Other things that are quite cool to play around with are motion blur, which essentially controls the shutter speed of the camera. So something this is quite useful for is if you have spinning objects like a rotor blade, and you want them to blur as they spin round. That is something that would be achieved by motion blur. Thank you very much for watching this video on post-processing and volumes. Do please stay tuned for more videos to support the BTEC Creative Digital Media Production course.